The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Of course, there are a lot of things that we could talk about today. First and foremost, welcome to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I am your host, Benjamin Dixon. Today is Tuesday, October 1st, 2019. Thank you so much for joining us. I missed you guys yesterday. Missed you all yesterday. Just had quite a bit of family things that needed my dire attention. And so here we are, Tuesday, second day of the week. I could talk about impeachment. I really do want to talk about Donald Trump's he's just an egomaniacal monster willing to destroy the country over his ego. I could talk about that, but I'm not. I just got off a call with a friend who's very active in activist spaces, organizing campaigns, petitions, voter registration. I mean, boots on the ground. And he was telling me about a conversation that he was having with a pollster. And it was something that I had not thought about, not considered. And somebody probably has. I don't know. Somebody other show, some other podcast that's better than mine has already talked about it. But they brought up the conversation about how it is that Bernie Sanders supporters are ultimately going to help Joe Biden win. And as crazy as that sounds, here's the logic. When you look at the polling, particularly in the South, and to get past Super Tuesday, you got to perform in the South. In the South, Joe Biden is the one who is taking votes away from Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren. Now, I don't have the data on this. I haven't seen the data myself. Let me put it like that. I have not seen the data myself. I'm thinking about getting this pollster on the show this week. But just anecdotally, that's true, right? As I talk to people here in the South, because contrary to popular belief, I do quite a bit out in public. And as I was speaking to people and listening to their politics, black folks particularly, older black folks specifically, they are supporting Joe Biden for any number of reasons. Nostalgia. It's kind of like, the reason you voted for Clinton is because you recognize the name, that kind of thing. Well, that matters in the South more than anywhere else because Bernie Sanders is outperforming with black millennials. He's outperforming. He's doing great with young black people in the South. But who's taking the votes from him? It's not Elizabeth Warren. It's Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to run the board in the South, and that's what he's counting on. That's what his entire strategy is based on. And so what happens? Instead of Bernie Sanders supporters, and this is, it's not just incumbent upon Bernie Sanders supporters, right? The Warren team has to do what they have to do. But instead of Bernie Sanders supporters targeting Joe Biden, which matters, all right? We'll get into the nuance of that in a minute. But where do we see all of the energy of Bernie Sanders supporters going? Bernie Sanders supporters feel like it is the utmost urgent that they draw a distinction between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders when we talk about the actual race as it unfolds. Super Tuesday is the most critical day of the year and the people of the election cycle, and the people who are being pulled away from Bernie Sanders in the South specifically are going to Joe Biden. And what does that do? That means that it's a good possibility because Elizabeth Warren supporters are not Bernie supporters, obviously, right? That's a truism. But they don't see Bernie Sanders as a direct substitute, as Bernie Sanders supporters see Elizabeth Warren as some type of simulacrum, right? Some type of sucrose to sugar, an artificial substitute. And so what happens is Bernie Sanders supporters are relentlessly, and when I say supporters, I'm not just talking about Twitter people. I'm talking about media personalities, people with platforms, people with influence, people with the ability to create a narrative that sticks. All right. This is a real phenomenon that ranges from that draws its potency from every corner of social media and regular mainstream media and independent media. When a narrative sticks, it is almost as powerful as breaking news, right? Or an October surprise. A narrative that sticks. And the narrative that is sticking in this campaign right now is that Elizabeth Warren is the artificial sweetener version of Bernie Sanders. That's the narrative. And who does that leave completely unscathed? Joe Biden. So here's how this plays out. You have the caucuses in Iowa, right? It's a toss-up. We'll see how that plays out, who wins. It really, that boils down basically to the best organizers. Then you have the primary in New Hampshire, fine. The caucus in caucus in Nevada in February, fine. South Carolina, though, February 29th, that's one of the first big bellwether votes. Because how South Carolina goes, often the South goes. And then you see the very next day, the very next primary, rather not next day, the next primary, March 3rd, Super Tuesday, Alabama, Arkansas, you have Texas, Tennessee, you have Virginia, you have a whole lot of southern states where Bernie Sanders could run the board against everyone with the exception of Joe Biden because of all of the support that Joe Biden is pulling in the South. And it's not just black folks, right? Joe Biden actually does well with some working class guys. Let's not forget that there is still a contingency in the Democratic Party of working class blue collar voters who align more closely with Joe Biden's sentiment about the world than they do Bernie Sanders' sentiment about the world. I think there's a foregone conclusion that's erroneous that people think just because Bernie Sanders is blue collar style populist that all of them are going to gravitate towards Bernie Sanders. But trust and believe there are plenty of Dixiecrats or the remnants of Dixiecrats, blue collar working class Democrats in the South who have an affinity for Joe Biden. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. South Carolina, really? It's going to be a weakened Bernie Sanders up against a weakened Joe Biden. They're pulling from each other. But everyone is focusing on Elizabeth Warren. The thrust of our energy has to be against Joe Biden, not just because I don't like him, but because he's literally pulling away from Bernie Sanders' victory in the South, specifically in the South. This phenomenon manifests itself across the country, and I'll have the pollster. I'm doing my best to get him on the show so he can break it down more succinctly. But if you just talk to people. This is why organizers have a better take on news sometimes than pollsters, right? Because they have the pulse of what's happening on the ground, right? They've had the conversations. They know, and I know from personal experience that you have a group of people who trust Joe Biden, and that is going to weaken Bernie Sanders' support in the South. Those people aren't going to go to Elizabeth Warren. Those people are more likely to go to Bernie Sanders because Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are not the substitutes that people make them out to be. Not because of policy, but simply because, their policies are similar in some ways, yes. But more specifically, they are not substitutes because the people who are going to vote for Joe Biden in the primaries, they have a deeply rooted trust and familiarity with Joe Biden, and they believe it's going to take a white man, to beat Donald Trump. They don't believe in supporting Elizabeth Warren. They don't believe that she can do it. Now they'll vote. Here's the catch. They'll all vote for whoever the nominee is. And we may be in a situation where that nominee is Joe Biden because we put all of our efforts into destroying Elizabeth Warren when it was Joe Biden who was the threat all along.
Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show.
And as always, I'd like to take this moment in the show to thank our newest patrons. Thomas S., thank you so much for becoming a patron. David B., thank you so much for becoming a patron. Jeremy G., thank you so much for becoming a patron. Annie, thank you so much for becoming a patron. And Carlos L., thank you so much for becoming a patron. You too can join this extremely elite group of highly intellectual, unbelievably attractive, and just extraordinarily talented group of people by going to www.patreon.com/the BPD show and becoming a patron today. Bonus is obviously that you get to listen to this without all the ads, which if you're like me, like I actually pay for YouTube Premium so I don't have to watch ads. And then whenever I log into someone else's account or use my wife's phone or my kids' accounts and they have ads and I'm like, holy hell, what the hell is this? You people actually sit through this? Like, I guess I've become extremely bougie at that point, but I can't do ads. And I'm sorry to have to make you guys do ads, but I got to pay for the show. So if you want to join this elite group who don't have to suffer through advertisements, go to patreon.com/the BPD show. Now, a little bit more on this conversation. I will talk about something else most likely, but right now I just have to double back. There is we cannot underestimate the power of social media and how it affects mainstream media, but more specifically how it affects independent media. And then when you look at the power of how social media affects independent media, like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, how it affects the creators, the people who generate the news, the Ben Dixons of the world, the Jimmy Dores of the world, the Michael Brooks of the world, you can see that what happens on social media absolutely affects and shapes our narrative. Our narratives, our presentations, my presentation, I have an outsized effect, right? I have followers who are actually in the mainstream news who, you know, hit me up in my DMs, ask me questions about my opinions, and sometimes they watch the show. They might even retweet the show sometimes, right? But because I have an outsized influence, just like anybody else in this space, Jimmy Dore, Michael Brooks, and everyone else, we have the ability to affect a mainstream narrative, right? I'm sure there's plenty of studies that have backed this up. What am I saying? I'm saying that we have created a narrative in 2020 already. It's not even 2020 yet, but already for 2020, that the primary problem for Bernie Sanders is the artificial substitute, Elizabeth Warren. And when it comes down to the actual caucuses and the actual primaries, the actual schedule, Super Tuesday, specifically in the South, more precisely, the real problem for Bernie Sanders is going to be Joe Biden. But this narrative is so strong and so pervasive that I guarantee you it's going to take an all-out scorched earth effort across social media and independent media to help people to realize that the real threat is Joe Biden. And not only will you not get Bernie Sanders to be president, you won't even get Elizabeth Warren. You won't even get the artificial sweetener. What you're going to end up with is this maniac, this guy who really probably should not have even been the vice president for, okay, I can't call him a maniac, but this dude who's well past his prime, and when he was in his prime, he was a problem. Joe Biden. We're going to end up with Joe Biden, which means we're going to end up with Donald Trump for another 4 years. And I've been wondering, I'm like, how in the hell did it get to be the case that now all of a sudden we put all of our energy into fighting against not only the person who probably is the closest in the race, right? But also the person who's actually helping Bernie Sanders in the race. I had a conversation with Sam Seder, the Majority Report, and it didn't really, he kept saying that Elizabeth Warren being in the race actually helps. And I agreed with them on the surface, but now thinking back on it, I'm sure Sam was talking about some of the same data. Sam's usually ahead of the curve. Like, that's one of the reasons I like going on his show, because he's probably one of the few guys out there that I think is smarter than me. Like, legitimately, like, he has a backlog of knowledge that I'm still acquiring. That's why I go on the show. Oh, and Thom Hartmann, for sure. If you want to know somebody who's genuinely smarter than me, and I actually feel like, okay, I got to step it up a bit, Thom Hartmann. But I digress. When I was on Sam Seder's show, he was talking about how important Elizabeth Warren was for Bernie Sanders. I would say it may not be, our arguments are a little different. I think it's more important for us to realize that Joe Biden is the real threat, not as Elizabeth Warren. She's not in the order of the primaries. And that firewall in the South, we saw what the firewall in the South did to Bernie Sanders with Hillary Clinton last cycle. But I digress. Let me get back on point. The point of this segment here is to point out, like, I was blown away by how consistent and how utterly surprising it was for this big behemoth block of voices on Twitter and on Facebook and just in some organizing spaces to come out so hard against Elizabeth Warren. And it's not really based on any coherent strategy. It's just based on, you don't like the fact that Elizabeth Warren has policies that are similar to Bernie Sanders. Now listen to the absurdity of this. We are going ham on Elizabeth Warren because her policies might very well be the Splenda to Bernie Sanders' pure cane sugar. That might be the case, but it's closest. And so instead of looking at the data and saying, who is the real target? Who is the real threat to Bernie Sanders' campaign? What people are doing is saying, let's attack the person who's closest because they might be a substitute. All the while, Elizabeth Warren's supporters are trying to tell you, we don't even like Bernie Sanders. You know what I mean? Like, do you know how many Warren supporters? Like, first of all, I think people don't believe she actually has supporters, which is supremely idiotic. Two, I don't think people think she has black supporters. I will tell you firsthand knowledge that she has a crap load of black supporters, and they intersect between two places: former Hillary staffers and former Bernie staffers. People who used to work for Bernie, literally, and people who used to volunteer for Bernie, literally. So she has black support. She has support in general, but it's not the numbers that we're talking about. And she's not pulling away from Bernie in a statistically significant fashion. The person who is actually taking voters, not activists, not organizers, not people who work I'm not talking about people who are in the system. I'm talking about your Joe Blow, who is going to maybe get up and go vote on election day. Those people who are getting pulled away from Bernie Sanders are being pulled away from Bernie Sanders in the South, specifically the black community and the working class community, and they're going for Joe Biden. But instead of anyone taking an analytical view of this, everyone is just jumping on this narrative of, we got to take down Elizabeth Warren. We have to take down Elizabeth Warren because she's such a bad choice. The hell is wrong with everybody? What is wrong? Would you rather... And honestly, here's another part. Maybe I should talk about this in the next segment. This new Bernie or bust, the resurgence of Bernie or bust, like Kiss, go to hell. Because what you're saying is that you would honestly rather see Donald Trump stay in power. The man who is threatening a civil war. The man who is threatening to, not just threatening to divide this country, but literally plunge us into something that is cataclysmic, not only for this country, but for the world. And if you think that's being dramatic, just look at how deranged he was this weekend in response to impeachment proceedings. You would rather keep him, the white supremacist in chief, who's caging people at the border, who is making it impossible for asylum seekers to cross and get asylum, an age-old agreement amongst nations all across the world is asylum. You would rather see him who's building a wall at the border, who's attacking LGBTQ rights, who's attacking Muslims left and right. You would rather see him in power than to see someone who might be the splendor, the equal, the sweet and low to Bernie Sanders' pure cane sugar. It's starting to make sense as I posed it last week. The reason no one is going to do that except me and maybe Sam. The reason no one is going to point this out to you and point out the fact that this is so destructive. And it's not only destructive, it's not destructive against Elizabeth Warren as much as you think, right? It's more destructive towards Bernie Sanders because you're not targeting the right person. And the reason you're not targeting the right person is the most absurd. You're not targeting the right person because she's the closest to Bernie Sanders. You're not targeting Joe Biden because Elizabeth Warren is the closest, even though her supporters don't believe that Sanders is a substitute, and you don't believe that Sanders is a substitute. But because you have a gut feeling that someone thinks that she's a substitute, you attack her instead of the real threat, who is the real substitute, Joe Biden. All right. Now, I can't say that I'm done with that conversation, but I think I will be done today. There is a pro-Assad group, Bashar al-Assad from Syria. There's a pro-Assad group here in the United States that has been awarding some commentators on the left with awards, cash prizes. This includes Jimmy Dore. This includes who else does it include? Caitlin Johnstone. Sound familiar? This includes the new woman on the scene, Kim Iverson. It is a pro-Assad lobby group, and they reward people on the left as well as the right. And the name of the group is the Association for Investment in Popular Action Committees. The acronym is AIPAC, but it is not AIPAC, the Israel lobby. And this story was broken by Bellingcat. Not my favorite website, but they use credible sources, and they have extremely detailed receipts and documentation showing the flow of money from this group, the Association for Investment in Popular Action Committees, to people like Jimmy Dore, Caitlin Johnstone, former Senator Dennis Kucinich, our former congressman and candidate for governor in Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, Kim Iverson. I'm just looking at the list of names. And, why does that matter? Why does it matter for me to bring it up in the context of the conversation that we've been having? Because you would be surprised at how many people are doing this for hire. How many people will stir up a fury, and they will create that fury in your audience, in their audience. And the purpose of creating that fury in that audience is to solidify their support base and to get the money that they need in order to succeed. Because it's hard out here. I honestly, sometimes I look at myself and say, I'm the dummy because I'm not the one doing that. Because if I did that, I'm sure I would have more resources than I could handle right now. But I digress. People are literally making money off of sowing dissent and confusion and any other type of subversive emotions. They play on it episode after episode after episode. And this is not to litigate the question of Syria and intervention in Syria, but this is to say that you need to check your sources and see who's really paying them. Even in your independent media, the same game that we complain about as one of the reasons why we all got into independent media, which is like backroom wheeling and dealing, money, corporate dollars going into the hands of pundits and news stations. We're starting to see it in these spaces. Caitlin Johnstone. She doesn't even really, I don't know if she does a show at this point, but just right. She just basically tweets, getting a journalism award, getting a journalism award from a pro-Assad group. And we see their coverage at best be opaque, right? Where you don't really know where they stand on a particular issue. But then at worst, we see them go full Assad apologists. And again, I'm not going to relitigate the whole conversation about what's happening in Syria because we have plenty of videos, plenty of tweets, plenty of conversations and articles about that. But I just want you to know some of us are getting paid to hold the positions that we hold, and some of us are not. And you say, well, Ben, we can't concretely say that it was a quid pro quo. Well, go read the article for yourself and make up the decision for yourself. That's all I have to say about that. I just want you to know that some of the independent voices that you believe in out here, and you swear by the fact that they're the most honest, they're getting checks. All right. So anyway, that's their business. Hey, let them get their checks. There's nothing illegal about it. Right. It might be a question of journalistic integrity. That definitely is a fair question, but there's nothing illegal about it. And they're paying their bills and probably paying their bills better than me. So, more power to them. But I think you as a viewer should be aware that man, some of us out here are laying it on the line simply for the truth, and others are getting. Listen, I mean, it's a direct. Now this part I talk about all the time, and this will be the last thing I say about it. The thing that you have to realize is that it's not just money that comes directly from like these agencies, these groups and these think tanks, right? It's not just those dollars. It is the fact that these people, and by these people I mean independent media personalities with YouTube channels and Twitter presences and able to control the narrative, they understand the power of alienating and like isolating their group from everyone else. And so they have a vested interest in sowing discord. They have a vested interest in peddling narratives about because it helps your audience if you're so pro Bernie that you're anti Warren, even if that means Bernie doesn't win. Because if we really discussed it and it was really about helping Bernie win, then we wouldn't just be pounding Elizabeth Warren all day. Elizabeth Warren. No. You'd be pounding the guy who was a direct threat to Bernie Sanders, particularly through the South, particularly in the order of the primary dates. It is the case that Joe Biden is the biggest threat to Bernie Sanders. It just is. Why do you think you saw people from the Bernie camp basically saying, hey, let's get along with Elizabeth Warren? You saw that for a while, and then his supporters, the Bernie supporters, was like, hell no, we're not working on it. But anyway, let me get back to my point. I'm not trying to make fun of people. I'm trying to point out the fact that you have a contingent of people. Now, don't get me wrong. I think some people are genuinely upset and worried and frustrated from 2016. Of course, they're going to be your true believers in this group. But those true believers are generally the people, the listener, the people who consume independent media. The rest of us, we know damn well what we're doing. We know that if we attack Elizabeth Warren and we just go so hard for Bernie, that there's an entire infrastructure. There's a Reddit group of like 1.4 million supporters. There's like, you could get to the top of Reddit. You could get to the top of YouTube. You could make money. You might even get yourself a position in the campaign. Hell, you might even get yourself a position in the presidency, in the White House. But you got to be able to burn everybody else. But the focus, this is Machiavellian. Like, The focus is on the one person who's helping Bernie. That's Elizabeth Warren. And so now you're attacking her, weakening her, but you're not attacking Joe Biden. Not weakening Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to glide through. And it will be because, well, nobody put any energy, not on social media, not in the places where it's most critical, not in the place where you create the narrative. What is the narrative right now? If you don't think I'm wrong, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, or if you think I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, you tell me what is the prevailing narrative so far? Is the narrative that Joe Biden is the real threat to Bernie Sanders? No. The real narrative is that Elizabeth Warren is the real threat to Bernie Sanders, and that's because she is the simulacrum. She is the artificial sweetener version of Bernie Sanders. Now, one of those two narratives you've heard, one of those two narratives you've operated based on, you've engaged based on, and now you tell me why that is the case. Why is it the case that the narrative, the prevailing narrative that's in front of us right now, is that it is the artificial substitute, Elizabeth Warren, who's the real threat, and not the actual threat, Joe Biden? Well, you know what? I've already answered it, but I'm going to leave that space for you to think. Why is it that consent has been manufactured so early on before we even get to 2020? Riddle me that. See you tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.